So this is in a nutshell what we do is three practices and dev data analytics and testing. And we are seeing more and more enablers coming through cloud data, mobile, as well as a lot of IoT happening in our business now. And in terms of customer segment, is either independent software vendors or mid to large companies in North America. So these are some of our customers with whom we work. Many of you know these names in town. Yeah, and as you will see, actually, there's a combination of technology companies and end user company, what we call. And then, see what the way we try to do this event is idea is to share the collective wisdom of this room. So that's why we share these people who are in the room. So feel free to network and learn from each other. So idea is really for this to be more a meeting ground rather than a monologue from us. And then on the panel, no, so Ralph was in this event. I think we did last year. Yeah, Ralph was there, and you know, people in the room they really liked what Ralph had to say because Ralph has run technology company as a CEO as well as a very active investor. He's on board of many technology companies, so he brings a different perspective. This year, we also tried to change a little bit of the who should be basically in the panel. So a lot of questions were coming around contract, privacy, intellectual property, those type of things. So we thought let us bring a lawyer in the room. I don't know whether that's a good idea or bad idea, but anyway. So we brought Ali in. Ali is one of the partners at Fasken, and he has an interesting background. He's a computer science graduate himself, and then he moved to law, so he understands a issue, and he helps obviously Optimus and our other partner companies like Bus and Ankel. So Ali knows how we work, and that might be good insight. And then last but not the least, we have Tej. Tej was with Deloitte for many years, and he recently left Deloitte, and he's an independent technology person now. So maybe they'll share more about them. So Ralph, would you like to share 90 seconds?
Okay, 90 seconds or 2 minutes, what you said here, Pankaj?
Yeah.
Is the sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a 41-year tech industry veteran in BC. First 28 years were as a founder and CEO. During the 28 years, I built 8 companies and sold 5 of them. And the big one that I'm known for is called Class Software, which is in the recreation department area of municipal governments. We were the big dog in that space and sold it to an outfit called the Active Network. And talking to James over there earlier today, apparently it's been moved along, but still in existence, so that's great. The last 13 years, according to me, I semi-retired. According to my wife, that's not quite true. I did 23 investments in direct tech companies, and I also am in 8 funds, so serious angel investor, probably one of the biggest in the Lower Mainland. And then, as a consequence, this time last year, I was chairman of 6 boards, and now it's down to 3. And have done a lot of outsourcing over the years, primarily with Class. So full disclosure, I met Pankaj in about 99, 2000 when you first arrived in Vancouver. I think I was his number 3 customer when he got here, and became number 1 in terms of size fairly shortly thereafter because I liked the model and I like Pankaj. And then more full disclosure, Pankaj and I enjoy traveling together. So in fact, I've been at his premises in Nuida a couple of times to visit there. So I'm actually surprised I am invited back because I thought I was a little controversial last year. I said Pankaj, so maybe that's why I'm here.
Ali?
Sure. So my name is Ali Barmal. I'm a partner in the technology group at Fasken Marno. For those of you who aren't familiar with Faskens, we're we're just across the street. Actually, we're a full service firm with 140 lawyers. So we handle everything from business, litigation, employment, and labor. So I kind of fit on the business side in technology, and we've got kind of a team of about 15 technology lawyers, ranging from everything from kind of corporate, commercial, to IP, life sciences, and kind of across the board. My practice is mainly focused on the corporate and commercial side, I would say. So the corporate side is kind of helping technology companies right through their life cycle. So it could be getting started, incorporated, sorting out their governance and shareholders agreements, all the way to raising seed money, angel money, venture money, and then hopefully either a nice exit or an acquisition of another company or multiple companies as they grow their business. On the commercial side, I kind of assist technology clients with their day-to-day business. So that could be commercial contracts, customer issues, licensing, and of course software outsourcing. And on the outsourcing side, I've done deals with outsourcing has kind of a broad meaning these days. It could be your traditional outsourcing in terms of large project or something moving over to an outsourcing provider, and I've done that with some of the large utilities and government entities in town. And then outsourcing is also kind of a lot of our clients will do the smaller kind of software development assignments with an Optimus or another company, and work with clients on that as well. And as Pankaj mentioned, I have a computer science degree before this from SFU, so kind of know enough to be dangerous, but my skills are kind of on the coding side and that kind of side are a few years behind, but definitely have that background, which helps me kind of understand what clients are going through and what their goals are. So happy to be here, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Tej?
Thanks, Pankaj. Yeah, my name is Tajinder Bassi, Tej for short. It's a pleasure to be here. Pankaj, I was just curious, you mentioned you invite Ralph back, but I was wondering what happened to the other panelists. A bit worrying. But just quickly, my background is with Deloitte. I've been responsible for growing their cybersecurity practice here in British Columbia for the last 16 years as partner, and obviously prior to that as a practitioner within the risk management and cybersecurity space. We also built a cloud service for our clients, essentially doing monitoring 24/7 around security and offering that as a cloud service. So it's been an interesting journey. Prior to that, I was actually more in the technology field, again, with similar to Ali, with a computer science background, into engineering and research aspects of technology, but moved into the whole consulting area. So that's been my main focus for the last 2 decades, is really helping clients manage risk around technology, whether it's large projects, whether it's transitioning to external outsourcers, and also some work with the cloud providers themselves, advising on how to shore up security, their security posture, and also help them to market this concept of trust and how to come across as trustworthy in the marketplace. So a couple of interesting dimensions. For the last couple of months since I've taken a leap away from Deloitte, I've been exploring the whole area of blockchain. Again, it's an interesting area for me personally, because it does connect with some of my background. So if anybody's interested in that, happy to chat later on. One of the things that we have done is developed a society called the Blockchain Society of BC. It's really a collaboration point and a connection point for those that are interested to connect with others that are in the same space as well as academia. So happy to chat about that offline, but great to be here. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Tej. So what we have tried to do is put 2 or 3 slides on the way we see outsourcing, and this is maybe a little bit biased view, but I think in last 15-20 years we have been working on outsourcing. We have seen some significant changes the way market has evolved. So one is, earlier it used to be a lot of focus on how to reduce cost, and this is happening. And by the way, this is not about offshoring, this is about outsourcing. We are seeing more and more across all the vendors, whether it is IBM or Capgemini or CGI, etc., that vendors used to focus, or CIOs used to focus a lot on. I have 200 people working here, can they work 200 people or 100 people somewhere else and just reduce cost? But today, with so many changes happening, the velocity has become more important. So cost is still a factor, but time to market and velocity are more important. Secondly, earlier what was happening was customers will keep the high-end work with them, and low-end work is what they will typically try to outsource. But more and more, because of time to market issues, customers are looking for very specific expertise, and they are happy to pay for it. For example, today in cloud world, we are seeing that whether it is with say Tribus on AWS side, customers say they are really giving high-end work, or in our case Azure and data analytics, etc. In a lot of that work we are getting. Also, it used to be hours based. Now it's becoming more and more outcome based, and that's actually happening in other professions also, like legal profession, etc. Where customers earlier we used to send the invoice by hours, but today customers saying this is the piece of work. At least give me an estimate and try to honor that. So, which has obviously changed the dimension on the vendor side. Whether you have low-end resources, high-end resources, how does the cost model work? So there are many more moving parts. Courtesy, cloud and mobile, and a lot of moving workforce, and part of it also the social things like millennials, etc. The workforce has become more global, and also it's very difficult now to figure out where the work is really happening with cloud, etc. So earlier it was to a specific location like Philippines or India or places in North America. Now it's more global. And actually, most of the clients don't care as long as the security issues are taken care of. The other point is earlier setting up the IT infrastructure itself with a vendor used to take few weeks or few months in terms of various security approvals. Now, because of cloud-based, it has become much faster. And the last point which we are seeing, which is actually hurting large companies quite a bit, is instead of customers giving multi-million dollar projects, the project sizes have shrunk. They will give maybe the dollar amount may be same, but that will be distributed across 10 or 20 projects. So obviously it brings an overhead on the project, as well as you need to be more agile in delivering those projects. And actually, Ali and I were chatting. What was happening was earlier customers used to build one single large monolithic system, but now with so many open source tools, so many APIs, so many things as a service, people are moving towards even serverless computing, etc. So it's all about interconnected systems. Many times you may not be even making a system; you might be just connecting various services. So I'll skip some points, but on IT security process, they are still very important, but the context has changed, and many times we come across RFPs from some government organizations. Some of those points which they still have, they don't even make sense in today's world. So that context has changed quite a bit. The good thing about the vendors is, and that's why today you see so many specialized vendors who are growing so fast, because the cost of a starting business has gone down significantly, and that's even true for technology companies. So because you don't need to invest a lot in infrastructure, most of the things today are available on pay as you go, and that's happening across all the industries. Like now we see this WeWork office here. You can go rent a desk for $600, and you have Wi-Fi, and you're ready to go. So any comments on any point which I missed? Jared? No? So the way we see outsourcing in the future is we think cost arbitrage will not be the primary driver, and also part of the reason is costs in India, etc., have gone up significantly. So really today it's very difficult to just actually one local technology company, their CEO called me a few weeks ago. They have a center in India, and they had opened it 4 or 5 years ago, and now he feels that cost of running that center is not, because they have only 20, 30 people there. The cost of running that place is higher than what they can get delivered from here. So that cost arbitrage really, which used to be the primary driver, that's no more the driver. We are also seeing that low-end outsourcing will significantly shrink, and that's why you are seeing a lot of companies like, again, IBM, Capgemini, Deloitte, and a lot of Indian offshoring vendors, they are struggling because more and more low-end things are being automated. So those jobs are disappearing. Same thing is happening in Philippines and in India, etc. So the niche vendors are definitely gaining market share because today what customers really want things to be delivered fast. And the cost of experiment has gone down significantly, so they are happy to take that risk and use a niche vendor. Also, what's happening, which I covered earlier, was that client and vendors today, they are saying that let's work on a project together. And that's where, again, I think the smaller vendors are benefiting because they are more agile in defining some of these processes and teams, etc. The I think the movement to cloud, I mean, all these, whether it's AWS or Azure or even Google Cloud, all of them are growing very, very significantly. So we think a lot of this typical data centers type of business is disappearing. Definitely not many people are investing anymore as vendors in them. And on the process automation side, a lot of artificial intelligence, machine learning is happening. That's why a lot of those jobs are disappearing. So there's definitely a need for more and more high end. And market is super, super hot. I'm sure we are seeing it in Vancouver. I was in Dallas on this weekend where Toyota is setting up a huge North American headquarters. Surprising how many jobs are open there, but very few low-end jobs. I think anybody who is setting up the new infrastructure, really, they are not hiring low-end workers and etc. I mean, it's surprising how that market is. At least for me, that's a great learning. And we did a tour of Tesla just a year or 2 years ago, and it's surprising how. I mean, there are not many employees. It looks like an empty plant, and no, which is very scary. And that's why education is becoming more and more important. So that brings you to the yes, Kit?
Yep.
I don't know how that process works, but maybe yeah.
Sure. So our question is, are you currently outsourcing? So if you have your mobile device, if you text one of these codes, depending on what your answer is, to 37607, it should mark your response on this. Just give everybody a minute to submit their answers. Tight race.
So by the way, when we started Optimus 8 or 9 years ago, we decided we will outsource everything which is not core. Core to us is really sell, market, and deliver. So all our accounting, all our recruiting, a lot of those things, we completely outsource here in Vancouver as well as in India. We have everything on the cloud. We have 0 servers in our office. We don't even buy machines. It's bring your own device. And it has made our life and my life as an entrepreneur so much easier. And it's very, very cost effective also. And I think really Google and Microsoft, they can do much better job of managing my email rather than me trying to run an email server. So that has helped, yeah. Yeah, so I'm surprised that no is such a big number. I thought many more people outsource, but yeah, maybe we have a big market to tap, yeah. so then why don't we start from you?
Oh, there's, do you want to discuss this? The next poll.
So you want to go to the next poll or?
Oh, no, I was just wanting to make sure that. I want to see if you're going to do the next poll or discuss this.
I was thinking we'll do next poll later. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah, no worries. Yeah.
So, so when you decided to outsource, obviously, what was the primary reason? Was it more around?
Okay. Kind of a lead in. Do you mind if I expanded a little bit, the question?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
That was okay. The primary reason for outsourcing was, let's be back about 99, 2000, is we were growing like heck. And quite frankly, in my opinion, I lost control of the business. So I'm going to ramble a little bit and we'll come back to answering Pankaj's question. So I think there's levels of optimum efficiency in tech companies, and I think it goes something like 5, 25, 75, and 200. And we were going by the 75 point with great velocity. And in my opinion, we were losing employee sat and customer sat. Employees would come up to me and say, I have no idea what I'm doing. And customers, we had a conference at Whistler at that point in time for class software, and we weren't getting good reviews in terms of quality product. So I had to get some management, if you wish, into the process. I did a couple of things. We brought in a management training person, plus we also started to outsource because we weren't getting any of the results we needed. So that leads me to kind of a little speech prep that I put together. My focus was always on customers, and I think customers in the product side need three things. They need product to deliver to them on time. In the case of class software, there was an optimum point in time in the year when they could actually do upgrades to the system, like put in a new system or upgrade to the system, train and learn and stuff like that. So it wasn't vendor choice, it was customer choice. And if you missed that slot, in fact, you probably waited a year. So on time, number one. Number two is on budget. And that meant there was a certain amount of money being provided to us that they wanted to pay for the value, and we had to deliver accordingly. And number three was on quality. And quality has multi-dimensions ranging from obviously bugs, but things like ease of use, response time, completeness of the feature set, the whole smorgasbord of delights in terms of what that meant. So on time, on budget, on quality equals customer satisfaction. And in my opinion, that's the fundamental tenet of every single business. So in the R&D section or part of the business, how does that happen? Well, you've got this individual, and I'm going to use just a placeholder today called the CTO, but it's that position that actually runs the team that starts delivering. So this CTO gets delivered, and I learned this from Microsoft actually many years ago. It's a pretty good model. There's a triangle, so it kind of looks like this, and at the top of the triangle is what time frame you have to hit in terms of delivery. On one part of the triangle, the second part is on the budget that you're given, and budget generally describes resources. And the third one over here is the feature set that you got to deliver, or the total requirements, if you wish, that have to get delivered. And many a time we get things like scope creep and the triangle breaks. So it doesn't stay connected. And the CTO's job is to deliver that triangle perfectly, right from start of job to end of job, and deal with all the vagaries as things happen. So, management mantra number three. Customer sat is directly proportional and related to employee sat. So if you move backwards, you have high employees that are really pleased with their job and love what they're doing. They're going to go the extra yard in terms of delivering customer sat. And the one prior to that, and this is an interesting factoid that Harvard pursued at length, is the boss. So do they have a great relationship with their boss as an employee, and that equals employee sat. So where I'm going is I'm backing into the CTO position, where it's a very sensitive position to try and maintain satisfaction by that individual, because he's got pressures. He's got to hit on time, on budget, on quality, but he's got to maintain morale as well. So in comes the outsourcing folks, and I don't know what some of the experiences are in this room, but I'd be really looking forward to that, is how do you actually get the insourcing strategy implemented inside a company? And in my opinion, it comes down to communications. So you need to declare boundary conditions, purpose, and so on. And purpose in our case was customer sat was going down, and we had to get that back on side. So we had to get a team that could actually deliver on time, on budget, on quality, and get our reputation back, which we did. We also declared that there was to be a certain percentage of manpower, if you wish, devoted to outsourcing, and generally it was about a quarter to a third. So we stuck with that rule over the years, and that avoided turnover, because that's the killer, is you end up getting people, good people, walking out the door that you obviously don't want to have happen. Especially in today's market, it's pretty scary out there right now in terms of hiring, as I suspect everybody in this room knows. And so we got that back online, and we also gave Pankaj some jobs that were, call it non-strategic. And we ended up not interfering with the mainstream, at least in the beginning of our core business. We kind of edged into it, but it was jobs like report generation and so on versus the really hard and more interesting code. So I think at that point in time, let me just summarize. So customer sat was my major focus in terms of why I brought in. It was not cost reduction. It was simply on time, on budget, on quality in terms of delivery of product.
So maybe I'll come to Page first. So from Deloitte perspective, what do you think? Why do customers will hire a company like Deloitte, and what's their biggest motivation and maybe the biggest fear?
So Deloitte is obviously an advisor to both cloud providers and clients, and I guess rather than getting to sort of why Deloitte, I mean they're big organization.
No, I'm saying
but in terms of observations of clients in the landscape, I would say it's the business case for going to cloud is obviously a significant business case, at least on paper. And the reason I say that is, and as Ralph pointed out, it does get into the core of your business. And if you think it's as simple as just taking a piece of the IT and putting it out there, that may be true in certain circumstances, but without a strategy, you won't really know. And so a lot of value came out of actually putting strategies together. And if you're part of that lower sort of 48% that haven't looked at cloud, I would certainly suggest that putting a strategy together is absolutely critical. So if you were to go to cloud, what would be the ROI? What are the things that you would do first that are least disruptive, I guess, to your business? Because it is a change in how you do business. So that was a big aspect. But I would say, the business case is so clear that, in my mind and in my experience, that if you're not considering it, well, you really should be, and you should be putting a strategy together. So that's kind of a few thoughts on the business case. One of the drivers that you didn't mention that I've also come across is kind of the some of the security aspects, and it's a double-edged sword on the security side, but I've come across many organizations that just don't want to deal with the hassle of both the administration as well as the security aspects of everything they need to manage. And we all know it's a growing area, and rather than continue to focus on that as an internal part of the business, it was an added sort of business driver, if you will, to move to outsourcing and say, hey, how do we leverage this outsourcing to improve security? And certainly there's potential there, which I can come back and talk about later on.
So Ali, as a company which wants to outsource, what are the top 2 or 3 things on the legal side they should keep in mind? It may be IP, it may be contract management, whatever.
I think it's interesting because that your initial description, I think, was bang on in terms of where outsourcing is going. So 10 years ago, we did an outsourcing deal for one of the large kind of government / large entity in town here, and it was kind of a data center outsourcing project. So at that time, data center outsourcing was, they had kind of probably a big room somewhere with a bunch of servers, et cetera, and a bunch of people who administered those servers, and they were kind of outsourcing that to one of the big shops in town. So, or the big shops kind of in North America, I should say, that kind of does this. And it's kind of probably a little bit before the cloud was more prevalent. And what that meant back then was, well, we've got a bunch of equipment to move over. Is the outsourcing company going to buy that and take it over? There's a bunch of employees who are either going to need to be transitioned or kind of lose their jobs, and that kind of needs to be considered. And then there was the whole services piece in terms of what they were going to do. So at that time, I can say that that contract was probably, about that high, probably 2 feet high with the services agreements, the schedules, and that kind of thing. I think things are shifting now in terms of, as Pankaj mentioned, smaller projects. The cloud has made things a little bit easier in terms of physical equipment and employees. So companies can be a lot more agile and make decisions without having to worry so much about fixed assets and employees all the time, which kind of makes it easier to outsource, I would say. There's still a lot of issues on the legal side that come in with outsourcing, and I think my comment on that, Pankaj, would be, I think, and I think Ralph touched on this, is when he was dealing with it at Class, his goal was customer satisfaction and on time, right feature set product. And I think from my perspective as a lawyer, the critical thing that I want to do early on when a client's thinking of outsourcing is kind of understand what their goals are, because I would say that for 10 different clients, you're going to get 10 different goal sets. So some might be like Ralph and say, look, I'm going to get a certain product on time, and my key focus is meeting these customer demands in a certain window. I have other clients who might say, we want to reduce cost, and that's pretty much the driving factor. Or it might be, look, we don't have the expertise in-house to do this, so I really need world-class expertise. Or it could be, as Pankaj mentioned, I just want to take this kind of off my plate and get it to somebody else. So I think what I try to do is understand that, to find out where their kind of needs and pain points are, and then from there, that list of the top 2 or 3 items we're negotiating can kind of evolve, you could say. So one example might be an organization might be struggling with kind of their current systems meeting customer expectations. So the SLAs in our outsourcing contract become much more important. Or if we're doing an outsourcing project where we're developing IP and we need to use that for our customers, and that's a critical part of our strategy to sell the company down the road, well, then IP is a big issue. We want to make sure we own all the IP, or at least we've got all that in a way that works for us. And I think understanding the client, or understanding your organization's kind of goals, and distilling it down to the top, there might be more than 2 or 3, but distilling it down is critical to do at the beginning, because from my perspective, it's sometimes surprising where clients are. You'll talk to them and say, okay, well, you want to reduce costs, and it sounds like you're having problems with uptime with your servers, and you want to move to somebody else. But then you ask them the question, what is your uptime, and what are you paying right now, and all that kind of stuff, and they can't necessarily answer those questions. So I think it's a bit of an exploratory process as a lawyer, and trying to help guide the client through that. Some already have it sorted out, but some don't. So I think that would be my overall comment, is just making sure before you go into outsourcing, you're understanding your goals, your objectives, the current state of affairs, so you can then establish, what your main priority points or negotiating points are going to be once you engage or start an RFP process or whatever it is.
Yeah, actually, the Fasken was on the other side. So you remember that one where you could not for us, but in a contract where we really did that work with, no Sharus was on that file, where they said, let's define 2 or 3 things. So we knew the CEO, the trust was not an issue, but the most important issue was company might be exiting in few years' time. So for them, the intellectual property and all those contracts are super tight. That was the most important thing. And they were using a lot of open source libraries. So how do we make sure that the ownership of the intellectual property is very well defined? So I think you're right. I think once you know what are the top 2 or 3 criteria, that's the real important point here. Anybody from the audience wants to? Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
So I have a question with regards to cloud-based services. One of the things my client always asks me is issues around that in terms of security is one thing, but also if the cloud company goes out of business, what happens to the data? And the last thing, because we don't have that many cloud services in Canada, most of the services are in the US, how does the Patriot Act impact Canadian companies?
So that's obviously a significant issue. I can give a couple of comments, and we can elaborate, as we go along here. I guess I would start off by saying, this concept of responsibility for the management of the data and management of the assets versus the accountability is a very clear distinction that you need to keep in mind. Ultimately, the accountability for the data and the protection of that by legislation will fall back to you as the client. when things go astray, nobody really asks, well, who was the outsourcer? And say, well, what happened to my data? And it's your fault. And similarly, legislators will come down hard on the owner of the assets and the owner of the data. So I think just understanding that responsibility you can outsource, but accountability you can never outsource is a very good starting point. Just a couple of things on the legislation. I know Ali will have more comments on this, but BC does have some of the strictest legislation around data residency, and particularly depending on what the nature of your business and whether you're a public sector organization or private sector, there's some pretty strict rules on where the data can actually be resident, and that means physically resident, whether or not it's encrypted. Again, it is really not the point. It has to stay within Canada. So that does require a deeper dive. And I would say I've been in situations where some of the sensitive data can be kept within Canada and the rest be outsourced off. So there are ways to overcome that particular challenge. But security in general is something that needs to be thought out up front, because not only is it a technology issue, but it comes into the concept of process. How do you manage? How do you administer? How do you govern? And how do you make sure that those lines of responsibility and accountability are absolutely clear? And we can get into specific examples later on, but I'll just pause there.
So just to add, I think now Microsoft as well as Amazon both have their centers in Canada. And Jared, you would like to add anything on cloud? Because that's what. So Jared runs Trinibus. They are the Canada's largest AWS service provider. Yeah. So I don't think it's that big an issue anymore. Yeah. Or
so I mean, it's in BC in particular. It's there's a fallacy on it's all around public sector organizations that have restrictions. A lot of the enterprise organizations feel like they have restrictions because they're under policy. That's not regulation. So they have a lot of policies that have to get through. And what Jadrid is saying around security, that's where really we find the biggest obstacle today. Not around so much data residency anymore, but really around security. Because the security posture going into cloud, everyone raises the flag, and you have to get around that. And I mean, the cloud is more secure because it's easier to secure yourself, but you have to get through that layer first.
we also come across technology vendors where they have certain deals for example, we work with a large security cameras company in town, and their customers are very clear that all the data which they capture that has to be on premise. They can't put it on cloud, but all the visualization and reports etc. they want it on cloud using say Microsoft Power BI or Amazon Insights etc. So then you have to figure out how to make that happen, and so that data doesn't reside on the cloud, but still you take advantage of cloud. So there are some of those unique use cases which do come into play. Yeah.
I can maybe add something to that. I think Tej gave a good summary of kind of what the kind of obligations are for the outsourcing company. I think it's pretty clear that the company is responsible and in the end liable for any kind of data breaches and any kind of security issues that come up. So what you want to do from a planning perspective and a contractual perspective is make sure that you are clear and pushing down contractually those obligations down to your service provider, your outsourcer, and also knowing what that is. So for example, in BC under PIPEDA, or actually in Canada as things cross borders under PIPEDA, the organization collecting and kind of storing security is the top level client. So you're responsible for what happens down the chain. So when you are working with your outsourcing company, you want to know what are you going to do it yourself? Are you going to subcontract or kind of outsource down the chain? And who's that going to be? Are you going to AWS, which has some good security, etc., or are you going to whoever stored Ashley Madison or Equifax's data, and that's going to be passed up to me, kind of thing. So I think that you want to kind of plan for that in your contracts and in your planning process. And I don't know if people have come across the OSFI guidelines before for outsourcing. Well, OSFI is kind of it's for financially regulated institutions, so it doesn't necessarily govern or apply to private organizations. But a lot of private organizations use that as kind of a standard to at least aspire to, or kind of a checklist to watch for. So OSFI has kind of a list of 6 kind of cloud computing areas. So that's worth checking out. So they talk about confidentiality, security, and separation of property. Is your property and your data being stored with somebody else's? Is it commingled? All that kind of stuff. Contingency planning, location. So where is it going to be stored? And as some have mentioned, in BC, if you're a public organization, in most cases you have to have the data stored in Canada. What's your access rights going to be? What are your audit rights? As I mentioned, what's the subcontracting structure going to be? So if you check out the OSFI guidelines, there's kind of a cloud computing top 6 that you can look at to kind of guide some of your kind of planning, I think, around that.
I would also mention one of the reference points to look at is also the Cloud Security Alliance. They've actually updated their framework. We've seen version 3, they've got a version 4 now, which is very comprehensive around the different aspects of security that are required. And you can even go through each of those and say, what's our responsibility? What's the cloud provider's responsibility? So a great starting point. But you're going to run into very specific issues depending on what you're outsourcing, whether it's platform as a service or software as a service, it's going to vary. So it's definitely one that's worth looking at and looking at before you get into a contract, because some of those provisions are worth putting in, ahead of time. But certainly, to me, the fundamental area is roles and responsibilities, because once that's defined, then you know what you're responsible for. And what it's going to boil down to is obviously you want to make sure that you don't have to deal with ever-expanding, challenging security issues that we constantly face these days, server updates and patch updates, all that kind of stuff. I mean, Amazon, Microsoft, they're pouring millions into security. So for any individual organization to keep up with that level of security, it just doesn't make sense. And so from a business standpoint, yes, you can definitely improve security, but you have to look at the residual responsibility once you have outsourced. And I would say they really come down to a few factors. One is endpoint security, because that's going to be ultimately your responsibility, because you're going to have endpoints, and you can share that responsibility as well and have the cloud provider help you with that. You're going to have to agree on the configurable components, such as the administration components. So who's going to administer? How are you going to sort of enable access to the cloud? You've got some choices there, and you can make that security commensurate with obviously the risk that you're taking. So you've got a number of options there, and ultimately it's about sort of that whole roles, responsibility, and governance. Well, one of the tips that I'll leave, and I'll pause there, is really look at the data, look at the life cycle of the data, look at whether you need to store all of the data on the cloud or whether you can maintain some of that in-house. Often I go to clients and say, where is this data? And they really can't answer it because it's often in multiple locations, including the cloud and so on. I would say it's a great opportunity if you are going through that transition, is not only to review the governance and the processes, but review the data lifecycle to say, let's use this opportunity to really clean up and get hygienic about data, because that'll really reduce the burden of security and protection of that as well.
And cloud, anyway, we had that before also. Basically, data centers are moving, and I'm oversimplifying, but it's really a shared services model where still they are physical data centers. So it's same as suppose your data center service provider disappears. You have the same risk and maybe higher risk. And but anyway, cloud is here to stay. I think it's surprising the speed at which things are moving there. Yeah?
Yeah,
so
if I could just also add one more thing, and just on all the points that Tutu was talking about, there, is the risk has really shifted more to the risk has really shifted more to the customer than the vendor. The big cloud providers have something called a shared responsibility model, and basically it is what you put on the cloud is your responsibility. They secure what's in the cloud. They secure what is their services. And what you put on it is your responsibility. So everything to do with access, everything to do with encryption is your choice, whether you decide to do it or not. And so that's a big shift based on how you used to secure your data in data centers, where the responsibility would be on the provider. A lot of it would be on the provider. Now that's shifted more to the customer.
Yeah. So coming back to outsourcing, maybe you can start with Ralph again. So what are 2 or 3 things really make them successful. And so maybe I can give one thing is, and this is a controversial, I'm just trying to provoke, at least in my experience, most of the projects fail because of customer, not because of the vendor. So it's very easy to blame the vendor, but really what happens is, see, ultimately, even when you are outsourcing, it is your project. It's surprising how many customers we come across where it's like just, no, I give the analogy of babysitting, correct? If babysitter, ultimately it's your baby. So you can't just outsource everything, say, oh, no, here's a problematic project, just throw it off the fence and this outsourcing vendor will fix it. That never happens, and most of those projects go for, they are over budget, obviously they never get delivered, and there's a lot of fight. And really those issues you can't solve through legal contract because ultimately, no, it is a mess. So what are the things we can do to avoid?
Okay, so we're going to go back in history here, Pankaj. Now remember I said I was customer number 3, so in fairness to Pankaj, he was breaking new ground with me. So what do you need to do? I find internal software development is a little light on specifications, thinking that the product marketing folks are just down the hall and around the corner to the R&D type. So if they've got a question on feature set, they can easily get that question answered. When you do outsource, it's got to be a whole lot tighter. So you need to make sure that, in fact, you write specs that are very, very precise in terms of expectations. And then project management as well. So you need both those skills. I think that's pretty obvious. However, Pankaj in his opening comments made an interesting observation. He's now down into, or you're doing outcome-based projects now. Let me make sure I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Is that otherwise known as piecework?
No, I think what happens is that actually you had to some extent. So the way defining really what the productivity and quality should be, there needs to be some benchmark around that. For example, you had that productivity thing that whatever the productivity in, say, class team is and what we have on my previous company's team, they should be within 10-15% variance. So I'll say that, so it can be an ongoing relationship, but still you measure the quality and productivity and velocity on an ongoing basis. Yeah.
Right. So what happened in the beginning with Pankaj was we did it on an hourly basis, hourly, daily. It was just meter driven. And one day I had a visit from some of the folks on the dev team, and it went something like, he's charging us about twice as much as what it would cost to do it internally. And so I go, that's not a good plan. So we went about fixing that plan. And we actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Pankaj, and maybe James back there, went to piecework, where we would define a piece of work with, as what Pankaj suggested, kind of boundary conditions, good plus minus, and also obviously dollars. So there would be time-based, dollar-based, and then I'll call it my other adjective, quality-based. And it worked out really well, in my opinion, but it took us a little time to get there. I expect Pankaj as an organization now has that as a standard operating procedure where he brings this model in. I don't know, I'll put him on the spot. But nonetheless, it worked out really, really well. So that was number 1, in my opinion, is kind of evolving to that. Number 2 was, I get back to the CTO position, and that fellow's the ham, or person is the ham in the sandwich. So down below, he's got the troops, and he's got to make sure that the troop morale stays up because employee sat directly relates to customer sat. And at the other level, he's got to make sure the CEO, otherwise known as shareholders, are really happy. So there's this element of cost and performance and standard commercial responsibilities. So the notion of outsourcing sometimes is an anathema to the troops, and you need to make sure that you communicate exactly what you're planning on doing. So I'll go down the list. I characterize, and Mike Satterfield taught me this phrase, is the project for the money or the mission. And the money means that there are some projects every organization does that's basically for margin, cash flow. It evolves over time, get into legacy projects and so on, and it's a reality. Those are excellent outsource opportunities. The mission is a strategic product, and you want to keep that knowledge in-house and very closely held amongst the staff. So strategic, non-strategic, first choice. Secondly, scale. So businesses that grow like this don't grow like that. Linear, they actually do one of these, up and down. And we used to call it the rubber band theory, where if at some point in time you needed expansion, went to Pankaj and you had the people to help out. And on the downstroke, if you needed to have a cutback, you actually had some people on the outsourcing side of it, excuse me, that could do the work as well. So I felt pretty comfortable as a CEO with that model. And that was obviously very reassuring to me. I'm going to go to today's market. I'm still heavily involved in a number of tech companies. Hiring in today's market is pretty scary. I think one of the senior management's responsibility is if you get rated for employees in the R&D team, and I'm involved with 2 right now that are getting rated, you better be prepared in order to continue to do development, albeit a different way. It's pretty scary out there. Had a fellow CTO come over from the UK in the last 6 months, took a look around the job market, and he's pretty scared. Boy, he's trying to hire another 6 over top of 8 in the company right now, and it's pretty darn hard. So I think it's kind of an insurance policy. The other areas the note I put down was ramp up learning or possibly a rewrite. You may be into a situation where you got to move from technology A to technology B, and I always considered that as a perfect strategy to outsource. And the reason for that is get started. So let's assume Optimus has the people that know the technology, you know the feature set, put the 2 together and get version 1 done, and then turn it over to the existing team so they can continue to do maintenance. I have found the people that build are different than the people that maintain. So it's a very good strategy to get it into version 1, therefore maintain and evolve and get there. The last one would be specialty skills. I'm involved with a number of companies that have called it engineering software requirements versus what I'll call workflow or routine IT stuff. And those are typical models for outsource as well. So I think probably best I allow some of the other panelists to answer questions.
Yeah, so what we are seeing is really a lot of our customers today are hiring us for specialty skills, particularly around moving to cloud, because the complete software architecture needs to change, or say there used to be old reports, how to make a much nicer interface or make their software, particularly in Vancouver, where we have a lot of technology companies moving to cloud, making the front end look more mobile friendly and all those things, and then visualization, etc. That's a big piece of work, and there are many moving parts, and hiding that skills is super hard, and you may not even have the work for them once that project is done. So that's where you see a lot of things happening here. Is anything to add?
Yeah, I think your question was around what makes cloud, this whole relationship with the cloud, really successful for organizations, and I would say it is the journey that you put together. It's, again, think about it as a journey and not a one-time event. I think we can get really carried away with being prescriptive around exactly what's going to be done, etc., and that's good for day one. But believe me, 6 months down the road, things will evolve and things will change, and kind of viewing it as a journey, where your needs will evolve, your business will evolve, there'll be changes in resource demands, etc. Thinking about it, longer term, and your baby analogy was a little bit startling to me, and kind of brought some interesting sort of images in my mind. But when I look at the babysitter concept, I look at the trustworthiness and I look at the experience of the organization, and I look at the ability to work. And so to me, it comes down to that single factor of, what is the relationship, what is the depth of capability, what's the experience, and what's the relationship you have with your outsourcer. Now, obviously, if it's a very prescriptive, contained requirement, that probably doesn't come into play as much because you basically outsource. But I suspect most people are looking to gain efficiencies, looking to evolve over time, and have a sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. So from a responsibility standpoint, right from the get-go, it needs to be very clear that's a shared responsibility. And if your cloud provider isn't coming to the table and saying, yes, I agree, it's a shared responsibility, and here's the mechanics of how it's going to work, here's how we're going to revisit things, and you'll know pretty quickly in the first 6 months whether that's a true statement or not. I think that's very important, because again, every client that I've worked with, one of the things they're really fearful about is this concept of lock-in. Because obviously as you build that relationship and you outsource more and more assets and your data to the cloud and to a certain provider, there is concern about lock-in, because transitioning away is going to be potentially more and more difficult as time goes on. I don't think that's something necessarily that should be a showstopper, because again, the cloud is inevitable, it's here to stay. But I think if we start to think about it as a journey and say, what's our business relationship? How does it feel? As well as contractually, and then over time just monitor the fact that if we're coming to the table and making things right, we're seeing challenges and we're overcoming them, and we're really focused on the business value and the effectiveness. To me, that is all the marks of a long-term relationship.
So what can go wrong, at least? So,
Yeah.
So I'm sure that's when people must be coming to you.
I think it's yeah. So that's kind of part of my job, is to kind of, not to be the kind of party pooper at the scene, but I got to advise clients on, what are you planning for, what could go wrong, and how are you going to deal with it. So I think if I'm thinking of 2 or 3 kind of key things that I advise clients to talk about, especially if you've got a process that's going to be, traditional outsourcing was kind of 5, 7, 10 years. We're probably shortening that time frame, but there are still going to be some that are kind of 1 or 2 years, or are going to be quite agile, because you're kind of figuring out specifications along the way with the client, that kind of thing. I think you want to have some good change management procedures in whatever contract you put in place. So if there's going to be a change to scope or price, etc., you want a process set out that says, here's how it's going to happen. And if you're the client, you want to know that the service provider has. They're not going to leave you in the lurch and say, well, no, you're changing this and we don't have personnel, or we don't have this or that, so we can't do it, and then you find yourself stuck. So you kind of want to have a change management procedure that requires that service provider to kind of, in good faith, and do their best to kind of get you what you need within obviously reasonable parameters. And I think establishing that early provides clarity to everybody, because if there's a certainty in outsourcing, our things are going to change, and sometimes you will have a relationship where you don't need to refer back to your procedure because everybody works together well, but you will have those that don't work so well, and you need to go back and say, well, look, you committed to doing what you need to do to make this happen for us, and we're not making unreasonable requests, so you're going to have to kind of staff up, or kind of allocate resources, or kind of make things happen for us. The other thing, and they kind of go together, are termination provisions and kind of transition plan. So, if your service provider is not delivering, you want something in your contract that you can rely upon to get out. So that could be, X number of service level breaches in a 30-day period, or it could be, missed milestones, or missed kind of whatever the case may be. So you may not use those. You may, if things are going well, and there's scope creep, etc., and it's not anybody's fault. It's just that's the way it goes. You may not exercise those. But what you don't want to be is in a position where you are stuck necessarily. So you want to weigh out if certain kind of quantitative things are met, and then on top of that, you're going to have to move to another provider, or you're going to have to bring it back in-house. So you want to have a basic transition plan at minimum in place to say, if nothing else, that the service provider is going to take reasonable efforts to, get your information back, your data back, to kind of, essentially help you transition over to a new provider, to bring it back in-house. And then from the other side, the service provider, may or may not want to do that for free. They're going to want to get compensated. So you can negotiate that based on kind of how the termination provisions are negotiated and drafted. And the last thing I would add to that is dispute resolution. So you want to have in your kind of agreement a dispute resolution clause that makes sense. And it shouldn't be, if there's a dispute, we're going to go to the courts in Vancouver and it's going to be governed by BC law, because this is an ongoing relationship. If you're in the spot where you've got to make a claim, or vice versa, between service provider and client, that relationship is not going to, regardless of what happens in court, that relationship is not going to function moving forward. Like you can just imagine somebody managing your data while you're suing them. Just doesn't work very well, right? So you want to have a dispute resolution process set out that is kind of business oriented. So it's, you know, the senior manager will look at it for this long. It'll get escalated to this group or the board after that. If we can't kind of reach resolution there, it might go to mediation, and then kind of you're a few steps removed from an actual court or arbitrated dispute, because once it gets there, I think things are not likely to come back in a very good way. So I think those are probably, just as practical tips, those are kind of some things you want to think about going into your kind of engagement from both sides, service provider and client.
The big issues which we face, at least I'd say last 12 months or 18 months, is as customers are moving to new technology, there are certain things which were done in a typical desktop system, etc. The way it looks on cloud or mobile, they are very different. So you can't do one-to-one mapping. And sometimes you don't even know that we are supposed to tell it to the clients. For example, and this is my top of the mind example is, we had a customer where the way old reports were done, you will have, they're very, very printer friendly. You can print them in all possible ways, etc. But now with all these new visualization and all those things moving on the cloud, etc., the printing is not the top of the mind for those vendors. So we had a customer where, oh, no, this is how I used to get my print before. Now I can't see this report in the same way. So, or there might be a lot of things which are, if you are using a lot of external libraries, etc., if you're not using custom code, there are limitations, etc. So those type of issues, and how do we share them with the customer, or customer shares with us and reach at an amicable solution.
Right.
So that's one thing, yeah.
Just in terms of what can go wrong, just to expand, one of the things that I had the benefit of being able to do with Deloitte is get exposed to a number of breaches, and breaches used to happen regularly, almost daily, I would say, and we had a team that basically goes out and diagnoses what went wrong, and some of the large brand names that you may have seen out there and hit the press, we were sort of privileged to get called in fairly early on, and here's how the scenario would play out. We'd go in and say, okay, we'd get a call and something's going wrong with our email, don't know what it is. Okay, who's your provider? And well, here's one provider and here's another one that owns the application set, etc. And then an hour later you'd get a call to say, well, actually now there's been money transferred to somewhere in Asia, and it's real money that's gone, and it looked like a real email, and so there's been the usual email phishing and spoofing going on. And even sort of by the time we actually get in to diagnose the event, these things accelerate pretty quickly. When we look backwards and say, well, how did this actually take place? It's usually some entry point, and the entry point could be anywhere within the ecosystem of where your data resides and where your access points are. So it could be the client, it could be one or more of the service providers that you use. And obviously, once the entry points is penetrated, the typical time for doing reconnaissance is close to a year. And so typically what happens is hackers would sit in your environment for a year and be able to sort of migrate and move around in stealth mode and really understand the environment and the network. And again, I won't get in detail into the stories, but the point really here is that it brings out this whole notion of, well, who's responsible? Because I can tell you, once we're in these heated situations and we're trying to gather the right information, one, there's a real lack of information because there's an assumption that various people have it. There's a lack of understanding of roles and responsibilities, and it really brings it home when one of these things take place. So again, my advice would be, if you want to prevent those types of situations, or at least make it easy to overcome those situations, it's great to think about the whole business continuity and the business resumption and incident response side of things. So if you haven't, again, thought about that plan and how does that plan change with outsourcing certain components, really good thing to think about. And one of the most valuable things you can do is a tabletop. Just bring in your team, your provider, your cloud provider, and run through a couple of scenarios and say, look, if these things went wrong, how quickly can you respond? And would you be able to provide this information? Do you actually log this information so we can diagnose who accessed what at what time? And then also talk about preventative measures. And it's a great way just to sort of improve your security posture, because again, if the responsibility is now dispersed, not accountability, but responsibility is now dispersed, you need to bring that entire group together and really get to grips with who needs to do what. So a really key point, and again, when you talk about what goes wrong, to me that is one of the things to avoid.
And if I can quickly add something to that, this is, you know, I don't want to get into the technical discussion on it, but this is where kind of the terms of your contract really make a difference. Or, you know, you can do all the planning to, you know, hopefully, you know, whose fault is it, whose responsibility is it, and who's going to fix it, all that kind of stuff. Where you have to be really careful in your outsourcing contract, any services contract altogether, is who's going to be responsible and what's your recourse going to be. So for anybody who's looked at contracts before, most of the time in a services contract, there's some kind of indemnity provision and limitation of liability. And usually usually a limitation of liability says, you know, in no event will either party or will the service provider be liable for any more than what they got paid out of this contract, as an example. That's kind of a typical limitation of liability clause. As a service provider or a client, you want to be really careful about what that says and what the exceptions to that are. So to give you a couple of kind of examples that come up all the time is that if you're outsourcing your software development to a service firm, you have, you know, if it's fully outsourced, for the most part, you don't really have control over who is kind of drafting the code and who is putting together the systems, what open source are they using, all that kind of stuff. So you want to have some parameters around that set out. And because you don't have control over it, if it turns out that they ripped off something from somewhere else and you don't have control, you're going to get sued, not them, because you're using that software. So if you've got a limitation of liability clause that says, you know, we're going to pay, you know, the maximum liability is what we paid, and you paid $100,000 for this software, you can bet that if you are any kind of decent sized company, you're going to get sued for a heck of a lot more than $100,000, and your legal costs are going to exceed that $100,000 on their own. So you want to be really careful and work with your counsel so that you've got appropriate carve-outs to the limitation of liability. So one example could be IP infringement, because that's not essentially anything that's out of your control or that the risk should be allocated to the other side should be carved out. And if you're the service provider, the other way around. So IP infringement is one of them. Kind of data breaches, security breaches are another one. Leaks of confidential information can be another one. So you want to make sure that you have the appropriate exclusions in your limitations so that hopefully it never gets to that point. But if it does, you don't want to be kind of the procurement person or the CEO going back to your CEO or your board and saying, well, you know, yeah, they screwed up. Yes, it was their fault and the contract says that. But by the way, like we're out $1 million, but we can only get $50,000 back. So, yeah.
Yeah, can I make more comments on what you just said, Alan? IP is really important when you sell. Because what's going to happen is you're going to get a giant audit through the source code, and the team that's coming in is looking for IP violations. And the last thing you want to do is it's about the 11th hour in the due diligence process leading to a close, and the red flag goes up. It's a serious issue.
If I may ask a question, it's both legal as well as with process project management from the IP perspective. So you're outsourcing some mission critical stuff that should be within your company, and the developer maybe in India, Philippines, Ukraine, what have you, they think there's value in what they've developed for you. They go out and develop a similar software and start selling to your competitors. Where's protection there?
Yeah, I mean that's going to be in your contract. And this, it gets kind of tricky because you've got the basic IP assignment clause, which is if I'm developing software for you, ideally your contract says that I'm assigning all the IP rights over to you. What that means is that, you know, under legal rights, I guess you could say, that's your software. I should not be able to use that for anybody else. It doesn't mean I can't go off and start from scratch and create something similar for somebody else, but I can't use what I created for you. And there's a big blurry line in between, as you can imagine. So what's the know-how that the developer has? How do you know what they're doing? If they're in India or the Philippines, how are you going to do anything about it? Are you going to go sue them over there? So part of it is getting the right terms into your contract to make sure you have ownership. And then the second part of it is kind of understanding the realities of how are you going to be able to police it? What can you do about it? How confidential or critical is it for you? What's the reputation of the service provider? But I think at a minimum, as Ralph said, you don't want to go into your process and have have your potential acquirer kind of walk away because they realize there's a gap in ownership. It's one thing to have a gap in kind of, there's only so much you can do practically speaking on control, but if you have legal ownership, that's a must. And I don't know if any, there's a situation on my desk right now which is kind of interesting. I don't know how prevalent this, Pankaj is talking about libraries and things like that. Does anybody here use a library called React or React Native? Yeah. So I've got a client right now who's had some work done, and there's a library called React Native, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think it helps kind of, it's from Facebook, and it helps kind of render screens on different platforms, etc. So different people are moving towards it. And what Facebook has in their open source terms is kind of what's called a BSD plus patents license, which means, yes, there's a license to the open source software, but if the company that's using that software ends up suing Facebook for anything related to patents, that license disappears. So my client kind of was asking, hey, can we use this? And kind of some of the risks were, if it may be that the client, who's kind of a growing Vancouver-based software company, they may not have any plans to sue Facebook in the near future, but you never know. And the thing that Facebook did is they made it for any patent suit against Facebook. It wasn't a patent suit for this software, which you sometimes see in the open source community. It was any suit overall. So we had the conversations around what are the risks, and one of the risks was, you may not have any plans to sue Facebook, but if your potential acquirer is going to be a Google or a whatever, they're going to do their black duck software scan before they acquire your company. They're going to see you're using this, and if they have any claims ongoing with Facebook, which is quite likely, that license is gone, and that's going to kind of potentially throw your deal. So there's a lot of backlash in the software development community on this.
And also, just to add, really, it is, and it's these issues generally don't happen with countries like Ukraine, India, Philippines, etc. You see more of those issues happening in North America. I'm just trying to correct the perception here.
Right.
Correct? You saw between Google and Uber, this was a big issue which happened a few years ago. No, sometimes we feel that if it's happening in a developing country, it's happening. Today, out of Fortune 500, maybe 495 are outsourcing work to countries like India across all the industries, whether it is Deloitte, whether it is Fasken, whether it is Boeing, or any of those. So I think the laws are pretty good in terms of protecting. But it's like the same risk you have here as an employee, correct? If you have an employee, if he goes and he starts on his own, and that happens all the time. So you can cover that to a certain extent, but that is a human trust issue that sometimes things do go sideways. Yeah. So why don't we open it for questions? If any, I think we have another 10 minutes. Devo, any question?
I had a question. What typical quality assurance or audit or any control you would recommend to exercise over outsourcing data?
I think you want to have certain. It depends on your project, right? So if you've got kind of a pretty agile project, small budget, small cost, low risk, you might choose to kind of simplify your contractual structure, and just based on, if you're hiring Pankaj, you'd ask around, he's good, that's enough for you to do it. If you're doing kind of bigger scope, bigger things, then I think you want to have, depends on your internal requirements and your reporting too, but you want to have some defined acceptance testing so that you've got recourse if you get product that's not quite up to par, and kind of a cycle where the developer will fix it without cost. You want to have some probably reporting if you have certain kind of key outcomes or key things you want met by the software, you want reporting that kind of meets those requirements. And then audit rights can depend, if they're working on your site or they're working completely off-site, and you kind of want to be able to come in and check progress and kind of make sure they're doing what kind of make the same, whether it's a big project, you might want to audit kind of timesheets and hours and expenses and that kind of stuff. So I think it would depend on what your project is, but I think acceptance testing, some reporting mechanisms, and then in some cases an audit right as client would be things that you kind of want to include.
And I wasn't sure, Devor, whether you were sort of talking about the quality of the overall service and effectiveness of what you're obtaining from the outsourcer versus the quality of a specific development project.
It's both. It's service.
So on the service side, because I think Ali covered the development sort of cycle, I think on the service side, right up front, there are things that a lot of outsourcers are putting in place that are actually standard reports that indicate, the level of quality they have around things like security and protection and so on. So if you haven't heard of things like SOC reports, again, it's an accounting standard. A lot of outsourcers have that. So you can ask for those sort of things, and you can also ask for specific, have a specific questionnaire around the things that are important to you. So, how is our data going to be managed? What are you going to do in the event of a breach? All that kind of stuff you can have up front. As far as managing quality on an ongoing basis, to me, it does come down to governance and roles and responsibilities, and having a lot of clarity to say, if we do these kind of things, here's the checkoffs and the sign-offs that we're going to have, and we have the right to sort of have open and active conversations around the level of satisfaction. And I think that malleability in the relationship, it kind of comes down to, because no matter how clearly you try to define some of these metrics up front, it comes down to the relationship. But there's a lot of things you can put up front, but if you don't have, again, from a governance standpoint, to say these are the processes that we're going to oversee, here's how the overall relationship is going to be managed, that senior level connection to, to the organization, that'll actually help to continue to manage quality, because things will change. The kind of things you're outsourcing will change. And I'm sure you've got lots of experience to share, Devora, around that as well. So feel free to share your views.
Maybe a comment more than a question. We talked about things that have changed, and most of the conversation here today was around work that is the domain of the CTO or the VP of products. One of the things I think has changed in the last 10 years or so is that as the focus has moved from cost to expertise, we've seen outsourcers much more involved in the customer acquisition phase, which is really the domain of the VP of sales and such. So, for example, willingness to cost share on a POC. Customers are a lot more comfortable with outsourcers being in the mix. 10, 15 years ago, they wanted the vendor's throat to choke, but they're more open to there being a couple of relationships that the customer has visibility into, so you can get the outsourcer cost sharing on the POC, risk sharing on the delivery phase of it as well. So, in smaller vendors, in my world, companies with single, double-digit millions in revenue, that's really, really valuable when you're selling into sort of Fortune 2000 size companies. So I don't know if that's true at Optimus, but we certainly see it.
No, that's true actually. And today he could not make it to the event, but we have a large customer. We have point of sale system guys. You might have heard of Squirrel. Squirrel Software, very well-established company in town. So they decided they're like 40,000-50,000 restaurants. But now with all these new point of sale system guys coming, which are very funky software and reporting, etc. Anyway, they're completely transforming. And we did a lot of POCs with them on how to do better visualization, how to move to Azure, how to make the mobile interface, etc. And then they took some of them to customers, and it has been a very, very significant piece of work in the last 18 months.
I would say, Mike, as well, we're seeing, so we work with a lot of gaming companies and that kind of thing. We're seeing outsourcing, not only software sales, we're seeing it in content. Content is king these days, so we've got the outsourcing of content creation, editing, art, characters, etc. in video games. So you're seeing it kind of in a whole bunch of different spaces now.
So customer education has become, and more than education, just doing a POC which they can take to the customers. Or for example, what you are trying with the Power BI streaming and some of those things, correct? Which you can clearly see whether that works or doesn't work. Those type of things.
And the concept of POCs is, again, a huge trend that I'm seeing is let's get it up and running fast. Let's see what it looks like, and then we can build out of requirements once we really get a look and feel of a POC that's very contained. And particularly in the data analytics space, I would say that's where we're seeing huge uptake and benefits realization. That if you can stand up a POC in a few weeks and you can touch and feel what visualization can really bring you, I think once you bring the business users in to see that, all of a sudden it creates a different level of conversation rather than hypothetically thinking about what reports you need to generate and so on. And then the final aspect of that is the ability to link in external data feeds into that data to show trends and other sort of useful business information. So I've seen that sort of conversation being elevated, and it's really as a result of those joint POCs that you referenced.
And those POCs have become so much easier and faster to do because of cloud and mobile and all these third-party services. You can just integrate in. show it rather than going through a lot of security approvals at the client place. Any other questions?
We did talk a lot about how we should go about by like choosing the right vendor, planning out the details, getting the contract in order. Considering all that is done, what do I need to know more as a team, as the ground person who's not going to work with an outsourced team? So what do I need to get in order there? Just to get the vendor onboarding sorted out, maybe the day-to-day activities. I know communication model, having a very good communication model, yes, that's going to work. Having the onboarding plan, like day one is going to be training and setting up access, however. So that is something that I am aware of. But other things that can help would be like based on your experience. What do you think really should be done? Like as a person who wants to use an outsourced partner, what should I be prepared for on a daily basis?
So that's after you've selected.
Yes, exactly.
So after you've selected, I would say it's really good to talk about the outcomes you're looking for and start the conversation there, right? Because everything else kind of follows that. Mm-hmm. And those can be as easy as saying, our day one outcome is expected to be this, and our longer term outcome expected to be B. And the more sort of business focused that conversation is, it really enriches the rest of the conversation as well, I would say. So that's what I would be doing, is really saying, look, given that we're outsourcing, but frankly, any experienced outsourcer will actually give you some options around how the journey could evolve, given your context, right, and help you with kind of crafting that journey. But if it's absent of true business outcomes, then really it's not going to, it's a chance that it can fall off the rails.
Absolutely agree. It's going to take you 12 months-ish to get used to the relationship and go through the ups and downs, if you wish, and there are going to be downs. Yes. So you need to figure out how that's going to be handled. Now, I'm going to put a plug in here for Pankaj. Pankaj's been doing this now 20 years, so he's got a pretty good business model, I'm sure, and I haven't seen it probably for the last 10 in detail, but nonetheless, I would expect that that's one of the things that he's going to be able to bring to the table. In the event of something not good happening, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to figure it out.
Yeah, and I would say kind of in terms of, this ties in with Pankaj as well, not to plug him too much, but there's not too many outsourcers who have a team in your time zone on the ground who you can meet with face to face. So I think this is a hybrid of what you're doing, selecting what you're doing after. But I did a deal with, and it's not an outsourcing deal, but I did an M&A transaction with Japan this summer. And it just so happened that in the morning, our morning was kind of, or their morning was kind of 5 o'clock our time. So it wasn't that bad to kind of, we talk in the morning, I'm talking between 5 and 7 for the latest kind of issues that have come up. And that was kind of workable. So I think what you should think about as well is when you're selecting and after, see how that matches up. Do they have a local office? What are your employees going to feel? If they're taking all their calls at 9 in the morning or 5 in the morning, they're probably not going to feel too good, as good about the relationship, regardless of how good that outsourcer is. So sometimes it's inevitable. Your expertise is somewhere, and but I would keep those practical considerations in mind when you're selecting, because that's going to influence a lot of what happens after. Even if they're providing great service, people are just grumpier at 5 in the morning.
The important thing is what's most important to you as a customer, and do you have that clearly defined and have a progress report based on that. So for example, I have a personal trainer. I mean, he's great. I'm dealing with him for 4 or 5 years, but he frustrates me because I'm asking him to use technology. So man, I want measurement, but the guy will not do it. So as a customer, you feel, why will he not do it? He feels, man, it's not important. And we face same thing with many customers. Sometimes we don't just listen. They say, we don't want a daily status report just as an email. To a customer, we are sending a nice PDF report every day. That was part of the requirement. And they say, no, we don't want this. We want email-based. So some of those things, listening, and from customer side, just defining what's important. But ultimately, we are human beings. We have our own things which we like to monitor. Like Ralph, I remember in the old days, he would like at the end of the month, how is the productivity here and this and how many use cases, etc. Right? That's important to the customer share, and that helps us improve in the process. Yeah.
So again, first off, it's a job. Do not think it's a part-time job. It's a job. Secondly, I think you need to do this with a long-term view of doing outsourcing, not just for 90 days or something like that. And lastly, just try and detect early. So if things are not going well, try and figure it out early, because it takes time to get some data, put it on the table, have the conversations, and nip it in the bud early. It's standard project management stuff, right? Where a good project manager has got a good sniffer in terms of stuff not working quite right,
Right.
and the earlier the better, and the more impactful the better as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot. I think we did not do the survey question because we are running out of time, and so, and this is right now the best-selling book on the charts by Hit Refresh, and there are a lot of interesting videos. Microsoft is really using this book as a part of their PR campaign. So you can see a lot of videos, but thanks a lot. So I thought instead of it's too early for a bottle of wine. So,
Okay.
so why not? Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ralph.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Pankaj? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pankaj.
Thanks, Ali.
Oh.
Thanks, Tej. Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. Some videos of Satya Nadella, who is Microsoft CEO, on empathy and how he's building a great organization. It's phenomenal how they've transformed the company, and yeah, very good. So thanks a lot. We'll still be around. There's some food and coffee. Feel free to